The morning a golf cart landed in my mailbox, I knew things had crossed a line nobody ever drew on a map, not even on paper with county seals. It was just one of those mornings, the sky the color of old denim, coffee gone cold on the porch rail, and then a cart, full of folding chairs and a papier-mâché gnome no less, came sputtering in like it belonged to my field. It didn't belong to my field, and neither did the men laughing in it. But the laughter was enough to start the slow burn that took us 3 years and 1 courtroom to put out. My name is Rhett Cole. The farm you're about to hear about has been ours longer than any of us in town have been alive. My granddaddy bought this parcel back when you could still buy a promise and not just a mortgage. 70 acres of red dirt and stubborn trees that lean like old men in the wind. We grew corn, raised a couple of dogs, and learned how to do things by feel how a plow should bite, where the spring runs fastest, which fence post will rot first. If this sounds poetic, it's only because fights over land make people remember things differently. You either remember the way the light hits the barn, or you remember the threat that made you go back inside and nail the windows shut. Both are part of it. Across the road from us one summer, a developer put up a tract of brand new houses, all painted like catalog dreams. They called it Cedar Glen. White picket illusions, squared hedges, mailboxes that matched the houses. And with those houses came a homeowners association. Not a problem at first. Rules make people comfortable. A few shared covenants keeps the grass tidy and the welcome mat straight. But the HOA was run by a very particular kind of person, Marianne Pike. Marianne wore a blazer even in July, smiled with her teeth, and measured people with her clipboard. She liked order the way some men like whiskey, slow, certain, and always within reach. The first note arrived on a Tuesday, tucked into my screen door like a polite viper. Please consider trimming the tall grass near your property line, it said, for safety and community standards. I laughed, I'll admit it. We had 3 seasons of grass here and a county line that wasn't a fence so much as a memory. I wrote back that farm life and landscaping standards did not often sit at the same table. Marianne circled 3 items on the back in blue ink and wrote, "This is for the safety of children." That's the lever people reach for the children. And you see how it makes a crowd sit up? That was the first taste of how power moved when it dressed itself in concern. At first it was just notes. Then came complaints filed with the county. Obstruction of easement. Nuisance. Someone parked a trailer by my gate one summer and left it there. It was gone the next day with a note that said, "Accidentally left behind," and smelled faintly of industrial coffee. The small humiliations became a pattern. People would stroll across our pasture as if they were in a park, picnic blankets in hand, kids trailing like gulls, ignoring the private property sign I'd hammered in last year. I'd ask them politely to leave, and they'd look at me like I was the problem, a curmudgeon ruining their charming country experience. The sheriff's office, bless them, had a hard time with this. Their job is to keep the peace, not adjudicate the atmosphere. This is civil, they'd tell me, hands on steering wheel, eyes on the horizon. Call the HOA, take it to court. The HOA did call, and when conversations failed, Marianne escalated. She sent letters. She circulated petitions. She hired a local attorney to threaten litigation. For all her primness, Marianne knew how to crowdsource a grievance. She gathered neighbors like twigs for a bonfire and added logs when things needed heat. We started documenting. Cameras on the eaves, an old drone that Jason's friend Jace Calloway, who'd come back from a tour as a structural tech and liked to tinker, could fly without hitting the town hall. We had photographs of tire tracks that cut across the field in the shape of polite disregard, footage of people walking past my clothesline like it was some roadside exhibit on rural neglect. Cameras get people in ways words don't. Footage is incontrovertible. Still, footage is also impersonal. For me, it cataloged the where and the insult. For Marianne, it was proof that the nuisance continued. There were nights when the trespassers were drunk and loud. There were mornings when my mailbox had a new dent and my fence was bent like it had been bent at the holidays by too much enthusiasm. Once someone spray painted a heart on the side of my barn the size of a mattress and signed it "Cedar Glen loves you." I thought about painting over it in a stroke of defiance, but I couldn't bring myself to waste paint on sarcasm. I left it. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe it was an act of restraint. I tell you that because restraint is a language people sometimes forget how to speak until they've spoken loudly enough. The escalation ground on like a wound. And like all slow wounds, it found infection. One night the cameras were smashed holes in the lenses like somebody had come into my life with a hammer and a vendetta. The dogs bayed and came back quiet. There's an animal part of you that believes if you're loud, you're alive. When the noise goes, you name the silence and it tastes like threat. Someone cut my fence in 3 places, neatly, like this was a chore. My neighbor told me he'd seen members of the HOA out after dark, carrying flashlights and laughter. The sheriff shrugged and said, "We need evidence." So I kept my evidence. We found a dusty cog in the county office's paper that doesn't look like much until you hold it in the light. A deed, older than the paved road into town, with an odd provision that spoke of reasonable measures to deter trespass upon the owner's domestic and agricultural holdings. It was vague. Legal phrasing is often a way of making the obvious sound like a riddle, but for me it read like an invitation. Not an invitation for violence, not in the least, but an invitation to set a boundary people couldn't ignore. That clause became something I could point to in my own head when the evenings kept getting briefer and the trouble kept getting bolder. Jace was with me when I showed him the paper. He's the sort of man who jokes about screw sizes to calm himself, who thinks in angles and load-bearing sentences, good at building things and at telling you what would hold if you put the right bolt in the right place. Jace said we could do something theatrical, something that would not harm anyone but would make a trespasser think twice. "Think of it like a stage set," he said, tapping a cigarette between his fingers, though he'd quit 3 years before. "Showmanship, not sabotage. Now, I want to be absolutely clear, we didn't make weapons. We didn't build any machine meant to maim or kill. There's a line I didn't cross, and not because I'm noble, mostly because I didn't want more trouble than I already had. What we did was gather things that make people uncomfortable. Enough light to seem like a runway, loud noise that hadn't been there before, fog machines from a theater supply store that puff and mimic an ambulance without being one. We put up warning signs, the kind that say "Do not enter" and "Private property" in big bold letters, so even the driver of a golf cart could see them from a block away. We mounted mirrors and motion sensors and bought a couple of battery-powered air horns used to scare birds from crops. Cheap, harmless, but startling. The point was to create a spectacle that made being on my land feel like stepping into a different stormy story. We rehearsed. Jace and I stood in the field at dusk and timed the fog with the lights. We practiced a controlled chaos that was more theater than trap smoke, a bright strobe that made people feel like they'd been stepped into a music video, and a recorded voice that said, reasonably and sternly, "Private property. Leave immediately." It was absurd, and it was serious all at once. Absurdities have a way of cutting through seriousness, and sometimes that's what you need. For a while, it worked. Groups who wandered onto our land returned to their subdivisions with stories about how the field had turned into a haunted stage, full of smoke and flashing lights and music that said, in a voice that wasn't any of ours, "Go on, move along." People hated it. Some called the county clerk and complained about excessive noise. Some laughed and said it was the best entertainment they'd seen. Marianne sent a letter calling the setup an intimidation campaign. I filed copies of her letters and kept them in a box next to my granddaddy's hammer. We were creating a narrative, and I wanted nothing to do with the part where I looked like the bully. Then came the garage sale. Cedar Glen decided to host a community yard sale the 3rd Saturday in May. They posted flyers, and because parking was tight in their little cul-de-sacs, someone suggested loudly and cheerfully that overflow parking could use the field near the Cole property. I'd been warned. Marianne herself came by 2 days before with her clipboard and a smile that I'd come to know like the weather, predictable and unnatural. She asked about parking and said, with a tilt of her head meant to be sweet, "We'd hate for Grandma Elsie to have to park 3 blocks away." The insinuation was clear. If I wanted peace, I should be the reasonable one. She said reasonable, like it was a favor. On the morning of the sale, the road was lined with folding tables and neighbors with price tags on their old life. People packed out, and the streets filled like a beehive in slow motion. A caravan turned into my property like an arrow. It was one of those things. You can see it coming, and you can still do nothing. The first car squeezed between the posts like it had a right. The second followed. A knot of people walked over my grass with their coffee and chairs and their opinion of me already decided. I stood on the porch with my coffee black, and Weekend watched them move as though this was public land. Jace nudged me and nodded toward the field, a small up-down that meant, Now. We flicked the theater switch. Fog rolled out, thick and tasting of glycerin and stage smoke. Lights snapped on bright, clean, ridiculous. A recorded voice, calm and professional, said, "Private property. Please leave immediately." It should have been funny. It wasn't. The first person who tried to turn around in the field lost their nerve when the fog swallowed the taillights. The air horn went off a short. Animal sound and people who'd been bargaining over old Tupperware looked up like they were in a circus. A golf cart, full of teenagers and a lawn flamingo, tried to cross. The fog made one of the teenagers swerve. The cart hit soft ground and rolled a gentle, ungainly somersault into a ditch. No one was really hurt. That's the part one Promisino one was injured. But the cart's passenger, a woman named Tanya who always had more eyeliner than sense, scrambled out like she'd been flung from a dream and started shouting that I'd tried to murder them. Mary Ann was at the edge of her board members like a queen at the edge of her court. She pointed at me and said, "You orchestrated this. You endangered my community." There were tears off laughter, of rage. It's hard to tell in a crowd. Someone called the sheriff. Someone else filmed on their phone, already editing in the head. The more they called me names, the more I felt the weight of the legal papers I'd stacked like a small fortress in my truck. In the aftermath, the town split like a cookie. Some people said I'd gone too far, that I should have called the number on the flyer and told them no. Some said I'd done what any reasonable person should do when their home is being treated like an open-access public space. Mary Ann's headline the next week read, "Threatening Tractor Terror," a little dramatic, but good copy. I didn't like to see my face next to the word terror. Nobody does. But I also didn't like the idea of someone sleeping at night thinking they could come across my land like it was a picnic table. The county opened an investigation. The sheriff rousted through the footage, and Mary Ann's attorneys filed civil complaints. I got a letter that said, in gentle legalese, that a suit could be filed for reckless endangerment and intimidation. That last word, intimidation, was meant to cut. It was meant to make me look like the person bringing fear. Mary Ann's board paraded list of complaints and members who told their versions of the story like weather reports. Always urgent, never precise. We went to court. The judge was a woman named Judge Alvarez, late 50s, with a look like someone who had seen men try to fix wrongs with loud things and had said, privately and quietly, "Do you think you're clever?" She listened as Mary Ann's lawyer put up a slideshow of the fog and the cart and the screaming. And as my lawyer, bless him, a man with more patience than sense, laid out the history of trespass and the videos of people walking through the cornrows as if they belonged to the bylaws. We had a new piece of evidence. The county worker who dug up the old deed was called to testify. He read the clause out loud, the one that said landowners could take reasonable measures to dissuade repeated incursions. Mary Ann's lawyer scoffed. Reasonable is a small, squishy word. The judge asked pointed questions about how many notifications I'd posted, if I'd called them, if I'd given any warning beyond a sign. I'd made sure to do that. Decent signs, polite notices. I even left a note on the main bulletin at the Cedar Glen Community Center that said, "Field closed to public parking." That note got stapled over with a flyer about bake sales before the dates even passed. In court, there were long moments where the air hung like a cold curtain. Jace leaned over and whispered, "You doing okay?" And I whispered back, "I am." That "I am" was both vow and bluff. Mary Ann took the stand and said to the judge with the smooth cadence of someone who's practiced sincerity, "He incited panic." She said it like a prayer. What the judge had, though, was a stack of photo timestamps and a pattern. People going on my property, despite signage. People ignoring polite requests. The smashed cameras that bore marks and matched the footprint of certain boots. Mary Ann's own letters. There were emails where she'd encouraged residents to consider community patrols as an option. She had, on paper, nudged them toward a solution that looked a lot like coordinated pressure. Judge Alvarez did a curious thing. She didn't dress her ruling in fireworks. She laid it out like a farmer lays out seed, methodical and practical. The court acknowledged that trespass had occurred repeatedly and that my measures, while theatrical, were designed to prevent further incursion and had been signposted. The court also said that property owners have an obligation not to create hazards. So the ruling was a split. The judge found that I had, in part, overstepped by using devices that could be mistaken for emergencies, and she ordered that I remove the fog machine from public-facing use and a shift to non-audio deterrence. But she also reprimanded the HOA for the sustained pattern of trespass and ordered them to pay for repairs to the damaged property and to fund a proper fence line. It wasn't a knockout. It wasn't poetic. It was a tidy, pragmatic thing that left both sides a bit pissed off and both sides a bit vindicated. After the ruling, Mary Ann's influence waned. People who had once joked about organizing petition drives quietly retreated from the front lines. Lawsuits are expensive, and the town has a way of moving its social weight to whichever people have the heft. A few board members resigned under the pressure of public opinion and bills. Mary Ann tried to rebrand as a victim of rural men and their stubbornness. She was given sympathetic columns by a few friends, but in the grocery store, when she reached for the ripe avocados, the checkout clerk avoided eye contact. Power, once administered in tight smiles, tends to leak when the folks on the receiving end start to open their mouths. We put up a proper fence, not because I wanted to wall myself off from the world, but because I wanted a boundary everybody could understand. No confusion, no ambiguity. The kind of fence you can't misread. We planted a row of locust trees along the edge so the wind would carry the sound of the road away from our porch. My dogs, who had learned to stop barking at the mailman and to bark more when strangers came for reasons I do not entirely understand, lay in the shade and looked at the new gate like it was a stranger. Standing there after the court order, I felt a strange emptiness. The fight had been loud and full of spectacle and the sort of gossip that turns into small-town myth. It had also become one more thing to explain at family gatherings, the part where the boy from the second generation fights the woman in the blazer, and they both end up with less innocence than they started. For all the public victory, there was a quiet cost. I kept thinking of the way my granddad had looked at the land when the first plow turned the soil steady, untouched by the petty things of town politics. The land is patient. People are not. In the days after, there were small reconciliations and small resentments. People from Cedar Glen would wave when they saw me on the road, half wave, eyes averted, like we'd all been in a car accident and survived, but couldn't talk about the bodies. Some brought pie. A woman named Elsie, who'd always loved my tomatoes and once told me I made the best cornbread for 50 miles, left a jar of jam on my stoop with a post-it that said, "For peace." I carried that jar like a small treaty. Sometimes at night I'd sit on the porch and think about the line between protecting what's yours and becoming the thing you've been fighting. It's an easy line to lose sight of, because outrage is a currency that notes itself as morality. The satisfaction of watching a golf cart grazing your mailbox and your neighbor blaming the neighbor for being mean can make you feel like you're in the right story. But stories change when you tell them. They mutate. They pick up details. People choose sides. The moral question, the one that sits under the courtroom's practicality, has stayed with me. When does defense become theater? When does theater become harm? There were nights, long after the cameras were fixed, when I'd walk the boundary and talk to the land like it's a person. I'd tell it, we did what we had to do, and I'd imagine it answering back in the creak of a fence post or the rustle of the locust leaves. This is the part of the story that isn't cinematic, the quiet patchwork of days where you reassemble things that were broken in public. You fix the fence, you apologize when you should have earlier, you bake a loaf of bread and bring it over to the neighbor who got caught in the fog and say, sincerely, "I'm sorry for the scare." Sometimes they accept, sometimes they don't. That's how people are. The town changed a little. Cedar Glen's HOA meetings became more mundane, less manic. People learned to park their cars where they belonged. I learned that I could be both a stubborn keeper of the field and someone who could be wrong. There was a humility in that. There was also the knowledge that if the peace were threatened again, I wouldn't flinch. Not because I wanted to be a spectacle maker again, but because I had seen what happens when you allow your land to become an extension of someone else's convenience. Now when I tell the story, I keep thinking about the frame, the first 3 sentences, the hook. People love the hook. They clip it and hold it aloft like evidence. But there's a longer part to the story that never makes the thumbnails. The small mercies and the small cruelties. The single person who smiled when no one else would. The kid who trod across my field with sticky hands and came back to thank me for my tomatoes because he'd liked them better than his mother's store-bought ones. Life is built more of those moments than of loud spectacles. That's not as sensational, but it's as real. If you ask me now whether I'd change what I did, I'd tell you this. I would have put up a fence earlier, sure. I would have tried harder at conversation before signs and before the fog. Yes. But I would also have kept my cameras. I would have kept the records. I would have kept my temper in the way a man keeps a good tool ready but restrained. People ask for a lesson, and lessons are never singular. They're messy. The one that sticks with me is simple. Set your boundaries, but be mindful of the method. Keep your dignity, but know the cost of defending it. So that's the way it happened. The golf cart in the mailbox, the fog, the courtroom, Mary Ann in her blazer, the judge with files thick as a Bible. It's the way one small town learned how to rearrange itself. My farm didn't change into a fortress. It became a place with a gate that says, plainly, please do not enter. It's a humbler thing than heroics, but in the quiet of certain mornings, it's enough. If you've sat through to the end, I want you to tell me, who was right, really? Was I a stubborn man protecting a family legacy, or did I escalate what could have been a small misunderstanding into something much larger? Did Mary Ann and her board have a point about public safety and the neatness of hedges, or did they weaponize civility to impose themselves on a landscape that didn't belong to them? Drop your thoughts in the comments, honest. Be specific. Tell me a time you stood your ground, or a time you wish you had. If you like this story, share it with someone who loves a slow-burn small-town drama. And if you didn't like it, tell me why. Argue with me. I've always found argument to be a way of sharpening what's left when the fuss is over. And if you live near a farm, tip your hat to it. Walk the edge of your own property and think about the line you'd fight for. The story's not over. Every season brings a new test. For now, the corn grows, the dogs sleep in the shade, and I drink my coffee on that porch until it gets cold.